Hi, welcome to Close Listening. I'm your host, Zach Morgenstern, joined as always by silent co-host Ludwig von B. And I'm going to be sharing a kind of special reaction moment with you. This is a true in-the-moment reaction. I'm going to be talking, pausing to listen to the songs, and then coming back and giving you my commentary. And I'm talking about this album, T for the Tillerman 2, or T for the Tillerman Squared. I'm not really sure how to pronounce it. But it is Cat Stevens, or Yusuf Islam's re-recording of his most acclaimed album of all time, and one of the most influential albums for me. Everything from the fact that he painted the cover art himself, to the fact that the songs, were each memorable in their own right, and there's a sort of simple naivety to them. They all sound kind of Mother Goose-ish, yet they're also profound poetry at the same time. So let's see what Yusuf Islam did with these re-recordings. So the first track on the album is Where Do the Children Play? And this was already a favorite song of mine because it's just a very profound, well-articulated, and yet in that Cat Stevens style, amazingly simple song. I remember this friend I had who's a bit to the right of me politically said, "I don't know about this song, it sounds kind of Luddite." And I said, "No, it's not Luddite." Yusuf explicitly says, "I think it's fine building jumbo planes, but problem, where do the children play?" We need to have the freedom to ask these questions. We can't just trust the developers and the free markets to keep doing things right. It's okay to have competing values with this. It doesn't mean you're anti-industrial or anti-technology, but we can have some competing values as well. Now, as for the actual arrangement here, it is not a radical departure, and thank goodness for that. Sometimes you'll see a remake of a movie and you're like, what was the point of that? They just did the same thing again and again. But for me, at least, that's not what I'm expecting from songs. If Yusuf completely reinvented himself, he wouldn't be Yusuf anymore. This is kind of like the epic feeling of hearing a song that you first heard on an album and then hearing it in a concert. So in some ways, it's more rustic than the individual. Yusuf's voice is aged, only a tiny bit. It's still beautiful, but it's not as rip-roaring as when he was young. And then at the beginning, he emphasizes the very simple musical parts by separating them a bit more. That very simple yet beautiful piano riff, that very simple yet beautiful guitar playing. And then before the third verse of the song, where there's already an iconic drum roll and it gets bigger, they find a way to make the sound even bigger, this time with, roaring guitars, but it's not supposed to be a pure rock song, it's supposed to be beautiful, so they bring in string arrangements as well. There are also some backup singers added. Basically, it's a tasteful, yet slightly more epic build on the original song, and I love it. Next on the album comes another classic, Hard-Headed Woman. This was actually the first Cat Stevens song I ever listened to, and one of the few that was a bit of an acquired taste for me, and that's not really a slight, it's just a slightly more unconventional chord structure, so once I did get used to the sound and grew to like it, it was fun to learn to play. And it's also just, a slightly unusual lyric. It's also a slightly unusual lyric. One might think hard-headed is a negative adjective, and so this song is actually being a bit provocative, being like, I want a woman who pushes back against me. I want a woman who challenged me. It's not like the simple song from the Elvis movie King Creole called Hard-Headed Woman, which is also fun, but far more conventional. Anyway, what's interesting about listening to this one is that Yusuf makes a small change to it. I guess being a singer-songwriter and feeling he has to be confessional, he changes it to, I've got myself a hard-headed woman. And indeed, he's been married since 1979 to Fawzia Mubarak Ali. One of the things that I think has frustrated me about Yusuf's music since he came back into the music industry is it seems to lack that yearning that was in his young music. It's like he's found himself through his religion, so he doesn't have that energy to give us anymore. But I think by returning to his old material, he's both able to say, yes, I've grown, I found my hard-headed woman, but he's still able to remember all those anxieties of his youth. So what's interesting about listening to this song is it sounds almost like the original, except when he says, I found myself my hard-headed woman. So he can both express, I'm at peace, but also he remembers what it's like to not be at peace. Otherwise, this song is a bit more rock and roll than the original recording, and that would have probably made it more accessible to me the first time I listened to it. But again, not trashing the original. It's a really cool, unique sounding folk song. Next on the album comes Wild World, which I would assume has to be the most famous song from the original T for the Tillerman recording. And less unsurprisingly, it's the one that, of the first three, has been changed the most. What's actually kind of interesting and provocative about it is the instrumentation at the beginning sounds pretty close to what was on the original recording, simple guitar and piano chords, except Yusuf has decided to match the lyrics to different chords. in the songs, so it sounds completely different, all the while it is the same. This one also, the yearning in his voice is more gone. It's more in favor of a kind of jazz club cool, and that's amped up when a clarinet is added to the album later. And, all I can imagine is that the original was too poppy, and Yusuf has just wanted to reinvent it over the years, and he has. So he's also done a version where he sings parts of it in Zulu. So next on the record comes Sad Lisa, or Sad Lisa, said in his pronunciation. And while Wild World was, a real rewrite, this one is pretty much the same. I mean, I'd have to go back and listen to the original to hear if there were any subtle differences. I mean, maybe the keyboard playing was slightly more experimental, but essentially the original is a profoundly simple song. Cat Stevens is really just playing arpeggios on the piano, and it's just a comforting, hauntingly beautiful ballad. Its simplicity is almost the point. You're like, wow, these lyrics are so simple and yet so comforting and so memorable. And so really the only changes is it's just his voice many years later, and it's cool to hear this old song revisited. He's like, Cat Stevens was comforting then, and Yusuf is comforting now. So the next song on this album is another of my favorites, though I don't know, maybe they're all my favorites. It's called Miles from Nowhere. This was the first song where I realized that Cat Stevens was a piano player. There was a video on YouTube of him playing it at a concert in 1976, and it inspired me to think that when I'm doing concerts, it would be fun to switch between guitar and piano, that maybe part of being the singer-songwriter is being able to, have relationships to these two different instruments. But I have the sense here that they're trying to play up the guitar more in this re-recording. I talked earlier about Where Do the Children Play, about how it doesn't sound too radically different, but it sounds like maybe more of a stadium version. And this one absolutely is. You can certainly hear more age in Yusuf's voice in this one. He's occasionally straining to do some of the singing he was doing before. But the effect of this song, when you have these electric guitars playing that weren't in the original, is that he's loving this as much as ever, that he's stronger than ever, that he's, made his comeback, and he's out on the stadium, and he's rocking, and he's still miles from nowhere, and he's still thinking to that and having a great time. Another great recording on this record. So next on the record comes a song called I Might Die Tonight. It's an existential song about how there's all this pressure in the world to just, move your way up in the workforce, and it's really hard to just focus on that unless you're, one of the few people who really loves your job when, we have this fear of death floating over our heads. Now, on the original T for the Tillerman album, this is maybe the weakest song, and that's only because every song on that album is about as perfect as it could be. So it feels like this might be the one where they wanted to give it the most life, and just there's a lot of instrumentation in the introduction and in the conclusion that wasn't in the original. In the original, it's quite a stripped-down song, and then at one point, Yusuf just takes his voice to another octave in the final singing component. It's just a really impressively intense performance, worthy of was always a very memorable song title. This one actually reminds me a bit of the period right before Cat Stevens really made it, when he made his first two albums, Matthew and Son and New Masters. So at the time, I believe he didn't really like these recordings because the producer wanted to include all this orchestral instrumentation, make it sound really rich, really theatrical, really over the top, whereas Cat Stevens came to want a more folk sound. But I mean, he's also someone who wanted to write a musical, and I think this theatrical style was always in him, so it really feels like it's a reference to the Dickensian and theatrical, labor-oriented album that was Matthew and Son. The next track on the album is called Longer Boats, and okay, this one has to be the most radical transformation of one of the original songs. So Longer Boats, has a memorable title. I believe it refers to the idea of Viking ships invading England. And the original song, I guess, was about sort of paranoia about outside or otherwise sinister forces. So whether it was a Viking invasion or possibly this preacher in the second verse, it's kind of unclear what the second verse in the original song is about. But the first two verses, and in fact the only two verses from that original song, from the original recording, are not included in this one. Where it does start is with a third verse that does date back to the original Cat Stevens days, because you can see him playing it in live concerts, where instead of talking about Vikings invading, he's talking possibly about aliens invading. And I guess there are all kinds of reasons why I wanted to change the song. Firstly, the original sounded like an atheist anthem. It certainly resonated with some of my atheist friends. And, maybe Yusuf is not hostile to that kind of thing, but it starts with, I don't want no gods on my lawn, and then there's the second verse about a preacher. So as someone who is now a Muslim, maybe he doesn't want to record a song that's perceived as hostile to religion. He skips right to the verse that he didn't get the chance to record before, about aliens. And overall, the song has a kind of gospel sound to it, even though there's a bit where he goes stripped down and revisits his original folk song. And then eventually he calls it a rap. So you eventually get this thing, it's referred to as a rap in the liner notes, but it's more of a speech by this guy called Brother Ali, and I assume he's speaking from the perspective of the aliens. And I think recording in this time, what Yusuf realizes is that while it might be normal to have paranoia about the outsiders, that right now is a time to be fighting xenophobia, and rather than presenting these aliens as scary Viking inventors, they're coming to bring peace and love from the other galaxy, and that's how we should think about aliens, whether literal or the now kind of dated metaphor for immigrants. Next on the album comes Into White. This is one of the Cat Stevens compositions that really does sound like a nursery rhyme. I built my house from barley rice, green pepper walls, and water ice. And kind of like Sadly So, there's very little change to the original here. I assume it's a sort of don't mess with success kind of thing. The one thing is you can hear the subtlest bit of horns towards the end of the song, and it's just, I guess, really masterful production that you're able to get in this instrument that a lot of people think is big, but it's really not intrusive over the slightly echoey guitar played by Yusuf and by his guitar player and longtime collaborator Alan Davies. I should have mentioned Alan Davies in Sad Lisa because he plays this sort of simple but haunting solo that goes with the simple piano playing. He was just such a huge part of the original Cat Stevens sound, so it's really cool to have his acoustic lead guitar playing on this record as well. Next on the record comes On the Road to Find Out. Yusuf has switched again into more radical readaptation. This time he's really playing it up as a blues song. There's a heavy beat. All I can imagine is kind of chain gang music influence there. Got some harmonica, you got some real tremolo sounds in the guitar. Overall, for me, it was just a bit too loud and out of whack with the rest of the sound, but I know that blues has always been an important part of Yusuf's musical imagining. A few years ago, he made a record called Tell 'Em I'm Gone, so this one's not particularly for me. I prefer the naive sound of the original On the Road to Find Out, but, it's part of his musical story. So, next song, Father and Son, one of the all-time classics. This version really hit me. So I had this outside hope that what it was going to be is a duet between Yusuf and his son Muhammad, who goes by the stage name Yorios. Yorios had this one really great song a while back called The Pied Piper, and I don't know if he's done much public music since then, so I really want to hear more from him, and I was hoping this one would be a duet between literal father and son, and it's not. But what it is way cooler, and I'm not going to spoil it. Just go listen to the song right now. It's not a radical change, but they do little things with strings to make it slightly more nostalgic, and I don't know, just listen to the song right now. It's really beautiful. So we just listened to the last track on the album, didn't we, Cthulhu? It is called Tea for the Tillerman, and that was another song that was really inspirational for me back in the day because it's not a full song. It's less than a minute long, so it's kind of like an epilogue to the record. And that's an idea I've tried to bring into some of my recording. But anyway, this one, it's pretty similar to the original. It's just a bit more stripped down. They don't add some sort of echoey voices at the end, don't add any strings or anything, and it's just, I guess, Yusuf saying, yeah, I'm still that guy at the piano. I'm still that same guy, and I just love playing my music, sometimes simple, sometimes more complicated. But I'm always Cat Stevens, and I'm also this new person too, and I make the same great music. So anyway, I had a really good time listening to this album. I originally listened to Cat Stevens' Greatest Hits, so I didn't get to have this magical experience with the original Tea for the Tillerman, so I was really glad I was able to have it with Tea for the Tillerman too. Cat, Yusuf, you're one of my great influences, so by some off chance you end up watching this video, I hope you appreciate the joy I felt listening to your record. I'm Zach Morgenstern. This is Ludwig von B. See you next time.